Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait one more minute before we get started, just to wait for people, give people time to keep coming. So still time to put the kettle on or do anything you need to do before we jump in. My name is Jamila Russian, and I'm a campaigner with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons here in Australia. I am going to kick us off just by passing across to our MC for this evening, and that is Professor Stephen Ratuva. And Stephen is a Pro Vice Chancellor for the Pacific, as well as Distinguished Professor and Director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies at the University of Canterbury in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He's an award-winning political sociologist, a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and a Chair of the International Political Science Association Research Committee on Climate Security and Planetary Politics. He's a former Chair of Security, Conflict and Democratisation Research Committee. We're really privileged to have you with us this evening, Stephen. Thank you so much for being here. And I will delightfully hand over to you now to take us through this event.
Well, thank you so much, Jamila. Good evening, everybody. Let me first of all acknowledge the sacred land of the Mana Whenua in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also First Nations of Australia. Welcome, everybody. Kia ora, which is hello in Aotearoa, and Bulavinaka from Fiji, where I originally come from, and Pacific greetings to all of you. Now, today's a very significant day. We are here to have a very robust discussion around the suggestions for Australia moving in the direction of acquiring nuclear associated weaponry systems. So in March 2026, the ICANN Australia launched the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration, which was endorsed by 150 civil society organizations. And so this is part of the process of organizing civil society organizations, the communities, and the people at large to think about and discuss and campaign against the renuclearization of a part of the world, of the Pacific. So it's a very important evening for us. And just before we start the process, let me, just for some housekeeping matters. So we are online. Everything is, of course, virtual. The kind of interaction is very, very limited. So if you want to ask questions, you have a question and answer button in front of you. You can ask your questions. And while the speakers are doing the presentation, I think it's very important that we keep our microphone muted because it will interfere with what's happening. Now, so as the theme of this discussion is no nuclear weapons in Australia. And just very briefly, for those of you who are still new to ICANN, I've had a long association with the senior members of ICANN for a long time, since the 1980s, with the Nuclear Free Independent Pacific Movement. And so the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICANN, is a global coalition of NGOs dedicated to the elimination of nuclear weapons, was founded in Melbourne, Australia, 2007. Some of you are in Melbourne right now, in other parts of Australia, in other parts of the world. And its pivotal role historically was establishment of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And ICAN engages with over 700 partners organization across the world. And some of you, of course, might know that ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, which is a pretty quite an amazing fit for a activist organization who's fighting for peace in the world. So one of the unique things about ICAN is the fact that it mobilizes grassroots people as part of its approach to disarmament. And so we're here to be part of that process. Now, just a bit of context, South Pacific context in relation to the nuclear issue. Since the Cold War, um, things have changed significantly in the region. And in my research over the years, I have basically categorized four phases of the way in which militarization and security in the Pacific have evolved. One was the Cold War period, when there was, testing by the United States, UK, and France of nuclear weapons in the Pacific as part of the arms race. And it was also the period of the growth of the peace movement in the 1970s, 1975, the nuclear independent Pacific. A lot of people in ICAN were part of the NFIP movement for a long time. And the second phase was the period of the war on terror since 9/11, and the focus on what it was referred to as Islamic extremism. And security in the Pacific was in some ways defined by the way in which that was used as the main narrative of security. And then the next phase was what I call the Sinophobic stage, the China versus the Western powers. And within that, basically two phases, sub-phases, as it were, the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, and the AUKUS, which basically in some ways took us back to the Cold War scenario of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, 80s up to the 90s. And of course, the last phase is where we are now, and that is the Trump 2.0 phase, or Trump's second coming, some might say, kind of chaotic and withdrawal of aid from the Pacific. And things have changed all over the place, not only in the Pacific, but around the world. And of course, the military-industrial complex is also very, very significant when you're talking about the nuclear issues in the Pacific. So I'll now just briefly talk about the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration. It was signed by 160 civil society groups. And the heart of the declaration is concerned about Australia's planned hosting of US nuclear-capable B-52 bombers and potentially nuclear-armed submarines, and the call for Australia to draw a red line on nuclear weapons by signing and ratifying the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. A number of countries in the world, some main ones, have not been able to do that. So that is just very, very briefly. I won't take up too much time. It's a subject which I like talking about, and I will stop right there. And we'll now move on to the next stage, which is our experts who are going to do the presentation. Now, there's supposed to be two presenters now. Professor Richard um, um, and Vince. But Richard, Professor Richard Tenter, is not here. So Vince Scapaptura is a sessional academic at the School of International Studies at Macquarie University. Is the author of the US Lobby and Australian Defence Policy, which discusses the considerable cost to Australia of its strong military ties to the US and draws into question notions of benign US power and contests the assumption that the US alliance promised to keep Australia safe from invasion. Now, so I will now ask Vince to take the floor, or rather the virtual floor, and Vince will give us an overview of some of those happenings in Australia in relation to the nuclear issue.
Introduction. Thank you to all the audience members for taking the time this evening to attend this webinar, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well, and of course to ICANN for organising this event. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I am present this evening, the Darramurrugal people, to pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. As Stephen mentioned, I was meant to be presenting tonight along with my colleague Richard Tanter. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, he was unable to make it. But I do want to acknowledge that much of the information upon which my remarks are based this evening derive from joint research that Richard and I have undertaken together. So I'll be presenting this evening on our behalf. Nevertheless, in case I misspeak, I do take full responsibility for anything and everything that comes out of my mouth this evening. Okay, Jamila, if we could move to the next slide, please. So the focus of my remarks tonight are on certain aspects of what I'm calling Australia's nuclear posture that are particularly relevant to the very welcome no nuclear weapons in Australia declaration issued by ICANN in March this year that Stephen just mentioned. That declaration, in sum, calls on the Albanese government to prohibit the entry, transit, or presence of nuclear weapons in Australian territory, waters and airspace, uphold Australia's commitments to a nuclear weapons-free world, and to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, to be clear, Australia does not and is not actively planning, as far as we know, to obtain its own independent nuclear capability or to permanently station American nuclear weapons on Australian soil in underground storage vaults akin to the nuclear sharing arrangements with certain NATO countries, if you're familiar with that. When I use the term Australia's nuclear posture, what I mean is the way in which American nuclear weapons factor into Australia's defence policy, and specifically the way Australia depends on and provides support to the US nuclear mission. In the case of Australian dependence on the US nuclear mission, this is the expectation that the United States would launch a retaliatory nuclear attack on any adversary that struck Australia with nuclear weapons. This is otherwise known as extended nuclear deterrence, and it has always been a dubious proposition. In terms of the way that Australia supports the US nuclear mission, which is going to be more the focus of my remarks this evening, there are in fact two stories to tell, one old-ish and one new. If we think about the US nuclear mission in simplified terms as involving, firstly, the command and control, communications and intelligence, and surveillance functions that support nuclear operations, and secondly, the nuclear weapons themselves and their delivery systems, then Australia has been involved in the first of these functions since the 1960s, when we began hosting key American intelligence and communications facilities, notably Pine Gap and Northwest Cape. There are also significant new dimensions to that old story, particularly in Australia supporting space surveillance, space control, and counter-space operations, which makes the old story also somewhat new. However, I don't want to talk any further about this oldish story, not because it's unimportant. To the contrary, by hosting these C3I facilities, as they're called, Australia is deeply implicated in supporting both US defensive and offensive nuclear operations, and by the same token is undoubtedly a nuclear target. Nevertheless, it is a story that is somewhat more familiar to Australians, I think. The new story is that for the first time, Australia's nuclear posture will involve supporting US nuclear operations by hosting and supporting nuclear-capable delivery systems that are postured for use in military operations, including possibly nuclear operations. This gives rise to the possibility, even likelihood, that nuclear weapons themselves will be introduced into Australia on these delivery systems at some point, and particularly during a crisis. The delivery systems that I'm referring to specifically are firstly the United States Air Force's long-range strategic bombers, particularly the up to 6 B-52 Stratofortress bombers that are to be forward deployed to Tyndall Air Base in Northern Australia. And secondly, the up to 4 United States Navy Virginia-class attack submarines that are to be de facto home-ported at HMAS Sterling in Western Australia. As one well-informed analyst who now works for the Department of Defence recognised closer to when these announcements were first made, Australia will soon become the only ally in the world to host and support military operations by forward-deployed US strategic bombers and SSN attack submarines. Next slide, please, Jamila. Okay, so this is our Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles. I apologise for the somewhat unflattering image. I can assure you I tried very hard to find a dignified image of our esteemed Deputy Prime Minister, but strangely this was the only one I could find. Anyway, the reason I bring up Mr. Marles is because I want to acknowledge at this point that, according to Marles, there are no new or significant developments when it comes to Australia's nuclear posture, particularly in relation to hosting nuclear-capable bombers. When an ABC Four Corners investigation revealed, through US Department of Defence tender contracts, that up to 6 B-52 bombers were to be forward-based at RAAF Tyndall near Katherine, Marles was apparently perplexed at the significant media and international interest. "I think everyone needs to take a deep breath here," he told reporters. Then he went on to strongly imply that there was nothing new about the revelations. In terms of US bombers, he said, they've been coming to Australia since the 1980s. They've been training in Australia since 2005. All of this is part of an initiative which was established in 2017. Like all clever politicians, Marles said nothing wrong while being entirely misleading at the same time. Next slide, Jamila, please. If we take a closer look at the planned B-52 deployment to Tyndall, we can see it's not your ordinary run-of-the-mill training exercise that characterised B-52 deployments to Australia in the past, since at least the end of the Cold War. I'll come back to the 1980s deployments in a moment. What makes the B-52 deployment to Tyndall significant is not solely the presence of the aircraft themselves, but the accompanying support infrastructure, and what that infrastructure implies about the nature of the bomber's presence. The US-funded expansion of RAAF Base Tyndall to support the B-52 deployment includes a squadron's operations facility for mission planning, crew briefings and intelligence, strategic fuel reserves to sustain operations, maintenance facilities, earth-covered magazines for stockpiling munitions, and an extended apron to support the B-52 bombers and C-17 transport aircraft. It is one matter to have US bombers visit Australia for training and interoperability exercises as they have in the past. It's quite another when they are accompanied by a dedicated infrastructure to support high-end warfighting and combined military operations in the region. In other words, these bombers are credibly postured for possible real-world operations, not just training exercises. Moreover, the RAAF have been engaged in an intense regime of interoperability exercises to enhance its capabilities for providing a wide range of direct support roles to US bombers and other fighter aircraft as well. These support roles include rapid ground hot pit refueling, mid-air tanker support, and air protection in the form of advanced fighter and electronic attack aircraft and airborne early warning command and control. In NATO parlance, these resemble the so-called snowcat operations undertaken by a number of non-nuclear European allies. Snowcat refers to support for nuclear operations with conventional air tactics. Altogether, by hosting forward-deployed B-52 bombers and support infrastructure for carrying out real-world operations, and training in interoperability exercises to provide extensive operational mission support, the RAAF will, for the first time in history, be in a position to support potential nuclear combat missions from Australian soil. One important qualification before I go on: I don't want to suggest that Australia's support for US nuclear operations is equivalent at the planning level to what currently exists within the NATO nuclear alliance. So there is no equivalent nuclear planning group in the Australia-US alliance. that serves as a mechanism for joint military planning and coordination specifically for nuclear operations. Although some influential defense commentators have actually begun suggesting there should be. Nevertheless, at the tactical and institutional level, there is already a very high degree of integration between the Australia and US militaries. Next slide, please, Stuart. So in a harbinger of things to come, Australia supported a US B-2 bomber strike in Yemen in October 2024. This was the first active demonstration of Australia's growing support role in US strategic bomber operations. The B-2s were not only granted access rights to Australian airspace, they were refueled mid-air by US tankers that had been pre-positioned on the ground at Cairns Airport, likely carrying jet fuel supplied by Australia. This marked the first time since World War II that Australian territory had been directly used to support US strategic bomber operations. And it prefigures, I think, similar and more prominent roles for Australia in American conventional and nuclear operations, not just in the Middle East, but in East Asia and the Pacific, and especially around China. And if you want to read more about that strike and its implications, I've included a link there at the bottom of the slide to something I wrote at the time. Next slide, Jamila, please. So I mentioned earlier that in addition to the B-52s, the other potential nuclear delivery system that is of particular concern is the United States Navy's Virginia-class attack submarines that are to be de facto home-ported at HMAS Sterling in Western Australia. At present, all US Navy surface vessels and submarines, apart from the SSBN, Nuclear Ballistic Missile Submarine Fleet, which has never made a port visit in Australia. Apart from them, the rest of the US Navy do not carry nuclear weapons and have not done so since 1991, when George H.W. Bush ordered their removal. The Tomahawk nuclear-armed submarine-launched cruise missiles that had been removed were for some time available for redeployment. However, in a process that was initiated by President Obama in 2010 and completed in 2013, those Tomahawk nuclear cruise missiles were in fact all retired. Then, during the first Trump administration, a program was initiated to develop a new nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. It's not yet in production, but the program has matured and is reportedly on schedule to be operationally deployed on Virginia-class attack submarines sometime in the early 2030s. It appears certain, therefore, that at some point in the near future, the Virginia-class submarines de facto home-ported at HMAS Sterling under the AUKUS arrangements will be nuclear capable and likely nuclear armed. Next slide, please, Joanna. So returning to the case of the US strategic bombers in Australia, I want to be clear that there is no evidence that B-52 bombers or other nuclear-capable bombers with a presence in Australia, like the B-2 bomber, have in the past carried nuclear weapons. It is not impossible that they have, but it's highly unlikely, not least because for many decades, US bombers have not typically flown with nuclear weapons in peacetime. It's just too dangerous. However, in the midst of a crisis or during wartime operations, the risks that they would be nuclear armed increase dramatically. While US bombers don't typically fly with nuclear weapons in peacetime, the US Navy certainly does sail with them. As I mentioned earlier, since 1991, this has been limited to the US Navy's SSBN nuclear ballistic missile fleet. However, with the planned deployment of nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles on the Virginia-class attack submarines, we are likely to see nuclear weapons introduced into Australia during peacetime via the AUKUS arrangements. In either case, whether it be the B-52 bombers or the Virginia-class submarines, the US has a policy of neither confirming nor denying whether any particular military platform is in fact carrying nuclear weapons. The Australian government understands and respects this policy. Moreover, there are no legal or policy impediments that would wholly prevent the US from introducing nuclear weapons into Australia. What this means is that, at the very minimum, the Australian public would not be told if nuclear weapons were ever introduced into Australia. And it may very well be the case that the Australian government also wouldn't know because they agree not to ask. This, I think it stands to reason, represents a profound violation of Australian sovereignty, or democratic transparency, or both. Next slide, Jamila, please. So I want to end by returning to Richard Marles's attempt to play down the news of the planned B-52 forward deployment to Tyndall, because in his formulation, these aircraft have been visiting Australia since the 1980s, so it's no big deal. I made the point earlier that what distinguishes the Tyndall B-52 deployment from other visits by B-52 bombers since the end of the Cold War is that these prior deployments were strictly confined to conducting training exercises and the like. In other words, they were not forward deployed to Australia to conduct real-world operations. In the case of the 1980s deployments, which were the first ever deployments of B-52s to Australia, the bombers staged through Darwin for two distinct purposes. The first was to conduct low-level terrain avoidance training over northern Australia to prepare B-52 crews for nuclear offensive operations against the Soviet Union. And the second was to conduct Indian Ocean maritime surveillance missions for monitoring Soviet naval forces. And this was part of a wider US Air Force mission to use B-52s for surveillance, interdiction, and mine-laying operations. The point is that the 1980s B-52 deployments, and specifically the maritime surveillance mission, was decidedly not a training exercise, but a real-world military operation. Now, this fact was not lost upon the Prime Minister of the time, the late Malcolm Fraser. Rejecting the government's right to know and to be in agreement with the operations and objectives of B-52 missions launched from Australian territory would be, in Fraser's words at the time, nothing less than a derogation of Australia's sovereignty. Consequently, Fraser insisted that American B-52s in Australia be unarmed and carry no bombs, including no nuclear weapons. Next slide, Jamila. Significantly, and in stark contrast to today, Fraser's nuclear heterodoxy did not understand and respect the US policy of neither confirm nor deny. To the contrary, it was a globally unprecedented and never to be repeated defiance of that policy. The key principles of Fraser's nuclear heterodoxy were: one, B-52s operating in Australian territory would not carry nuclear weapons. Two, the Australian government would retain the right to approve any change in the mission parameters. Three, Parliament would be informed of any such changes. And four, the United States would publicly consent to these arrangements. I think that is a fairly reasonable framework that the present Australian government could resurrect in relation to US nuclear-capable bombers in Australia today, and indeed all nuclear-capable platforms in Australian territory, airspace, or territorial waters. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Vince, for that very, very comprehensive, very interesting, a brilliant presentation, quite detailed in terms of the dynamics of what's been happening in Australia in relation to the B-52 bombers, and the potential for carrying nuclear weapons and into Australia and providing bases, as well as the nuclear submarines. So I'm sure there will be questions. The question and answer template is online. I can see a question there already, but we'll wait until towards the end, at the end when we come back and respond to your questions. Thank you so much for that, Vince. So just before I introduce the second speaker, Joy Tau, just briefly, while Vince was talking, I was also thinking in terms of the bigger ramifications in the region in relation to the historical developments, particularly in relation to the Treaty of Rarotonga, or the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, which the Pacific leaders, including Australia as well and New Zealand, was signed in 1986 by Australia, Cook Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, New Zealand, Niue, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, in Rarotonga, where basically three protocols were being articulated. One was no manufacture, stationing, or testing of nuclear weapons in their territories within the zone. no use against the parties to the treaty or against territories where Protocol 1 is in force, and no testing within the zone. It was in those days in response to the nuclear testing, not just nuclear testing, and also the transshipment of waste, and also of the time of the Cold War. The Pacific was used as what was referred to as the chicken game between the Soviet nuclear submarines and the Typhoons and the American Trident submarines, and possibilities of accidents and all those things were something which were being considered as well. So yeah, the Treaty of Rarotonga still exists now. Interestingly, New Zealand, which is was not invited to be part of AUKUS for a number of reasons, declared itself nuclear free in 1986, I think, and followed by nuclear legislation, I think 1987, something which Australia, I believe, is far from achieving at this point in time. So yeah, so just a background to as Vince was talking about, New Zealand will be Australia hosting the American nuclear capabilities in terms of B-52 and submarines, and how, to what extent does that undermine Australia's commitment to the Rarotonga Treaty. So the next presenter is Joy Tau. Now, Joy Tau is the coordinator of the Pacific Network on Globalization, or PANG, and is chair of the Pacific Regional NGO, or PRINGO, Alliance. Joy is a seasoned media and communication specialist with extensive experience and expertise in policy, communications, research, and campaigns from his work across intergovernmental, civil society, public and private sector organizations. Now, those of you who are not familiar with PANG, PANG is a regional watchdog set up to ensure people's rights and self-determining, self-reliant, and self-sufficient existence are being recognized and upheld. And the Pacific Regional NGO, or the PRINGO Alliance, is a collective of umbrella civil society organizations across the Pacific region dedicated to unified advocacy and people-centered regionalism. So like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about ICANN, ICANN is a collection of mostly grassroots organizations connecting at the global level and campaigning against nuclear weaponization. So in the Pacific, the PANG has been, PRINGO, PANG and others have been quite active in that front. So so Joy will be looking at it from the point of view of the Pacific, looking at Australia, which is our neighbor. Often some Australian leaders, they refer to the Pacific as our backyard. It's not a backyard. Backyard is where you dump all your unwanted garbage, when in fact, the Pacific is the neighbor, it's a neighborhood. So does Australia, as a big Pacific power, do they have the moral responsibility for its Pacific neighbors? So that's something which Joy will talk about from the Pacific perspective. So Joy, which, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that oh, it's not working. My video was off. Oh, gosh. But you still can hear me.
Yes, Professor.
Yeah, Joy.
Thank you so much for
sorry, my video just came on. So sorry about that, Joy. The problem with the virtual world is very, convenient. At the same time, there are all kinds of issues. So Joy, please.
Vinaka, Professor. Thank you so much. Good evening, colleagues. And Pacific greetings wherever you're joining us, either in this part of the world or other regions globally. We grateful to be on this other distinguished speakers. Thank you, Professor, for the introduction. And maybe before I could speak to the Pacific context or the perspectives of civil society on how Australia places itself within the region, in particular to this issue of nuclear weapons, regionally, but also internationally, as Australia continues to pursue military or security agreements with its external partners, really to just acknowledge, and you spoke very well and in depth around the Rarotonga Treaty that seems to be the basis, not seems, but is rather the basis of when the Pacific drew the blue line. We understand red lines. I think it was an act of the Pacific acknowledging the violent and really disturbing history that our region has gone through and continues to live with the impacts of nuclear testing. So, in acknowledging that, the Pacific has come a long way in asserting or drawing this blue line to protect our region, declaring it a nuclear free zone. Very fitting. I think this year will also commemorate the 40th anniversary of its entry into force. But it still stands as a pillar that really protects the Pacific from most of these modern day developments, be it Australia, be it New Zealand, or any partner of the region. But really wanted to just acknowledge some of the initial movements or the earlier movements that really drove the region to drawing this blue line in the likes of NFIP, the Nuclear Free Independent Pacific Movement. Glad to see some names, some familiar names in the attendance tonight rather, PCRC, and the Pacific Conference of Churches, who have been behind the Nuclear Free Pacific Movement or Nuclear Justice Movement in the Pacific. Very recent institutions like PANG, the Pringo Alliance, and many, the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, and many who continue to advocate for a nuclear-free Pacific. Maybe in response, and it's overwhelming to see that over 160 signatories to the declaration, and that goes to show that the Pacific continues to advocate, calling on Australia. And I think it is Australia's responsibility as a party to the Rarotonga Treaty to ensure that it upholds the Pacific's call or declaration as a nuclear-free zone. But very recently, last year, Australia also, and I like how Professor said, when we use terminologies to associate, and it's interesting how Australia sees the Pacific as its neighbor, in some terms, Vuvale, in the context of Fiji. And we continue to question this, how Australia associates itself with the region, not to get out of topic into the geopolitics of relationships, but it really questions Australia's role in the Pacific. Last year, Australia also joined the region, declaring the Pacific Oceans of Peace as another standing pillar that calls for safeguarding of our region against militarization activities and so forth. So as Australia continues to commit politically or through some of these standing agreements, I think listening to the earlier speaker, Vince, speak about Australia's ambitions, its security ambitions, its military ambitions, these are very concerning for Pacific groups. We have, since the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement days, Pacific groups continue to maintain our regional stance. Our narrative has not changed, declaring the region, calling for denuclearization, demilitarization. We cannot speak about denuclearizing the region in absence of speaking about the need to demilitarize. And also, when we talk about demilitarize, we also need to associate decolonization with the issues. So these are three standing issues that the Pacific has continued to advocate, continued to see how best the region could also inform other international treaties that supports or rather safeguards our region. Since the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we have seen the region, 13 parties that have from the region that have upheld this international treaty. When we really hope that Australia As a Vuvale, as a party to the region, as a close neighbor, we hope Australia upholds its commitment to ensuring that the Pacific is a nuclear-free zone. Very quickly to end and allow opportunities for questions and answer is this concern as Australia tries to diplomatically or with its security ambitions, in partnership with Australia and other external partners, there is also this concern around how Australia is pursuing security agreements in the region, be it the Step Up program and this Puk Treaty. This also questions how Australia's external partnerships are with either US, the France, or any, how they would pursue this through some of these bilateral agreements through either Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and some of the other territories where they see strategic to run most of this military exercise. This is also to spotlight Australia's commitment to some of the PAC Rim exercises that it does with the US in Hawaii, in the Northern Pacific. This is not to say that this is happening in isolation. Some of these territories that are in association to the US are part of the Pacific. And we need to look broader in Australia's compact agreements through some of this military exercise and how should it go down this nuclear pathway. How does it impact the Pacific? Just to reiterate, the Pacific civil society concerns, we are calling for a denuclearization of the region and demilitarization. They go hand in hand. So I'll leave it at that, Professor, and will be available at the end for questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that, Joey. Very an excellent articulation of the view from the Pacific. You raised a number of very, very significant points in relation to how Australia has been framing the region through its step up narrative. Was not so much to ensure the stepping up in relation to development in the Pacific, but very much step up against the Chinese influence in the region. So it's very much geostrategic in that sense. And of course, Vuvale, using a local terminology, it means family. It's a way of encompassing its influence in a soft power way by bringing in the Pacific into its fold in a way which no longer subtle. So the Falepili deal with Tuvalu, for instance, Tuvaluans come to Australia, and Australia basically takes over the sovereign security aspects of the island. So there's a lot of those things which are linked to, I suppose, Australia's engagement with America. In New Zealand, we see things differently from the vantage point of Aotearoa. Historically, New Zealand has had a long history of an independent foreign policy, although every now and then that kind of fizzles out and then re-articulates itself in different ways. While, for instance, the NZAS Treaty between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, which was very much at the heart of the Cold War mobilization in the Pacific to ensure that the Pacific remains within the Western hands. And after New Zealand declared a nuclear-free policy, the US was not very happy with it. And so in some ways, basically sanctioned New Zealand until 2011, when the Prime Minister of New Zealand went to see Obama sorry, not Obama, whoever was president then in the United States. So yeah, so thanks so much for that, Joy. Now let me introduce you to I'm just looking at the time, and I have to make sure that we are on time. We are a few minutes behind at the moment because I suppose because it's winter and people are trying to get warm. And now we're warm enough to speed up a little bit. So I will I'll now invite Jamila, who is one of our tech support person, to show us a video of the declaration. Some of you are probably familiar with. Some of you may have seen the video. Some of you probably haven't seen it. So it's going to be in just a few minutes of your time, just to refresh us, just to give us an idea of what the declaration was all about.
My name is Jennifer Tierney, and I'm the Chief Executive at Oxfam Australia. Nuclear weapons pose an unacceptable risk to people on our planet, and we believe Australia must take a clear stand against them. Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed us that nuclear weapons are the most destructive and inhumane weapons ever created. We know about the multi-generational health impacts of nuclear testing in the Pacific and South Australia, and we see right now in the Middle East how the struggle for control over nuclear weapons creates war. That's why we proudly support the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration and call on Australia to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons during this term of government.
My name is Reverend Carissa Sully, President of the Uniting Church in Australia, and we support the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration. The gospel of Christ calls us to be peacemakers, to choose life in a world where violence threatens it. As a church committed to justice, reconciliation, and the dignity of all people, we believe nuclear weapons have no place in our future. They do not bring security, and they threaten life itself. That is why we call for their dismantling and for Australia to join the majority of nations by signing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in this term of government. This will take courage and it will take love overcoming fear. So join us and stand for peace.
Bulbinaka, my name is Epeli Suma and I work for the Pacific Network on Globalizations, or PANG. PANG is honored to support and endorse ICANN Australia's declaration, reminding Australia of its commitments under the Treaty of Rarotonga and to support and ratify the TPNW. PANG stands for Nuclear Ways for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific.
Nisambula Vinaka, I'm Reverend James Bhagwan, General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches. As we mark 40 years since the signing of the Treaty of Rarotonga, we support the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration. The Blue Pacific has already carried the human and ecological wounds of nuclear testing. We call on Australia to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Nuclear weapons have no place in our region or our future.
Hi, my name is Terry Slevin and I'm Chief Executive Officer of the Public Health Association of Australia. Today, in the escalating geopolitical tension, people are scared and uncertainty rules. And it's not so far away from us. The risk of use of nuclear weapons seems real. Even a limited nuclear war in one region could cause climate disruption and starvation worldwide. We're urging the Australian government to join the UN Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. 50 countries have already done so. Through AUKUS and other means, we appear to be deepening our role in nuclear possession, planning, control, targeting and threats, but also hosting nuclear-capable aircraft and vessels. In enabling the presence of nuclear weapons in Australia, we could become a launch pad for nuclear war or an even higher priority target for adversaries. with regard to our region, nuclear-free status, then it comes to the planes, the ships and subs our allies are carrying weapons. Neither confirm or deny is good enough. It's not good enough when I go to the airport today to neither confirm or deny weapons in my luggage. When it comes to nuclear weapons, we have the right to know and the right to say no. Australia is a party to the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty and Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. To protect us all, our government should sign and ratify the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We should reject nuclear ambiguity and prohibit the entry, transit and presence of nuclear weapons and end all forms of assistance to nuclear weapons activities. Everybody loses a nuclear war. Please help us stop this madness.
As teachers and education support staff, our mission is to build a better future for our students across Australia. That's why we are proud to support the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration. Nuclear weapons are a direct threat to our students and to the planet that they will inherit. So we urge the Australian government to make sure that nuclear weapons never have a place in Australia.
My name is Anne Walker and I'm a National Executive Director of Catholic Religious Australia. As the representative body of leaders of Catholic religious congregations across Australia, CRA supports the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration. CRA believes we have a sacred duty to protect the sanctity of life and to promote peace amongst peoples and nations that is achieved through dialogue and negotiations and not through nuclear deterrence. The Holy See was one of the first to sign and ratify the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, and we call on the Australian government to do the same in this term of government so that Australia plays its part in working towards the elimination of nuclear weapons.
I'm David Ritter, CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Greenpeace was founded in 1971 by brave activists opposing nuclear weapons testing. Nuclear weapons pose catastrophic risks to the environment and people's lives. And we saw this firsthand when we helped evacuate the Marshallese community of the island of Rongelat, which had been rendered uninhabitable by US nuclear testing. As an organisation that is committed to environmental protection and climate justice, we know that nuclear weapons have no place in a safe future. That's why Greenpeace Australia Pacific supports the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration, and we call on Australia to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in this term of government.
Hi, my name is Dr. Kate Wiley and I'm the Executive Director of Doctors for the Environment Australia. We proudly support the No Nuclear Weapons in Australia Declaration. Nuclear weapons pose an unacceptable risk to people, to communities and to our planet. As an organisation committed to human and environmental health, we believe Australia must take a clear stand against nuclear weapons. This is because of their immense capacity to take lives and destroy our natural world. Such terribly destructive and dangerous things should not be allowed to continue. So we're calling on the Australian government to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to ensure nuclear weapons have no place in Australia's future. Join us in supporting the declaration. Thanks.
Oh, thanks so much for that. That was amazing. A lot of excellent messages in there. There's no need to explain things further. Well articulated, and I'm sure we've all been inspired by the messages coming out from different people representing different organizations. The declaration had widespread support amongst environmental groups, humanitarian groups, Pacific and Australians, etc. So it's amazing. Now, let me also state here that the declaration is still open for signature by civil society organizations or your organizations. Please make the opportunity, take advantage of the opportunity to sign up if you haven't. So in the interest of time, it's getting late into the night here in New Zealand. since this is where the new day begins, although the Fijians disagree with that. The next presenter is Emma is director of the Australian Institute for Australia Institute's International Security Affairs Program. Emma is a historian and writer, focused on history and politics of the United States and its role in the world. Emma's first book, Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States, was published by Hardy Grant in 2021. She writes regularly for Australian and international outlets and appears regularly on Australian radio and television. So I suppose the question I want to pose Emma Sotis is the perception of Australia of the US and its alliance. The US over the years have built up its alliance globally, and of course Australia is part of it. What it means for global security. Is it a trustworthy alliance, or is it an alliance falling apart as a result of what's happening now with Trump? So Emma will be looking at global context and perceptions of the US alliance and the shifting public opinion towards the alliance and the opportunity for change amidst the crisis. So Emma, your turn to speak, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that lovely introduction. I am coming to you from Melbourne, the birthplace of ICANN, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations, whose sovereignty was never ceded. And I acknowledge the incredible work that First Nations activists have done in the non-proliferation space, and the work that Pacifica peoples have also done in this space and continue to do in this space. As Stephen said, my focus is largely on Australia's relationship with the United States and where it might be headed, where that alliance might be headed, because it certainly is on some pretty rocky ground at the moment. And I think Australians are deeply concerned about what that means for our future, for the future of our security, and particularly in relation to nuclear weapons. And so that's really what I wanted to cover today, because the current environment, as we just heard in that video, is particularly concerning when it comes to nuclear proliferation. And that is largely due to the current occupant of the White House, who has made repeated threats, implicit and explicit, around the use of nuclear weapons. Some of you will recall in his first term, he talked about his access to a big red button and the fact that his button worked better than anybody else's. He is also reportedly asked questions like, we make nuclear weapons, so why don't we use them? And more recently, the President of the United States made an explicit threat to commit genocide against the Iranian people when he threatened to obliterate Iranian civilization. And implicit in that, I think, was a nuclear threat, because how do you obliterate a civilization overnight? You don't do that with conventional weapons. You do that with nuclear weapons. So all of that is a way of saying that the barriers against nuclear use are crumbling, and in some cases are being deliberately destroyed, like with the expiration of the New START treaty, for example. And that's true internationally, but it's also true in domestic US law, where it increasingly appears that those laws are not binding on the president. And I think it's worth stating, we talk a lot in this space about the undermining or the potential destruction of international law and what that means for the global order. But I think what Trump shows us is not just that structure is under threat, but that the very principle that underpinned international law is also under threat. The foundational principle that underpins the UN Charter, which, crudely put, is that killing people is bad and should be avoided. The Trump administration is actively and deliberately undermining that principle. And as we've heard from other speakers today, that has very serious implications for Australia in particular, given our relationship with the United States, the relationship, that deeply integrated relationship that Vince outlined in particular raises very serious questions for Australian complicity, Australian sovereignty, Australian independence, and Australian security. But really, what I wanted to share with you tonight, I think in contrast with Vince's very accurate outline of the Australian government's position, is that our research suggests that the Australian people recognise the reality of what is happening and the potential implications for Australia. So we did some polling research at the Australia Institute, and we asked Australians who they thought was the greater threat to global peace, Donald Trump, the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, or the leader of China, Xi Jinping. And 52% of Australians chose Donald Trump, which means that a majority of Australians believe that the leader of our most important security ally is also the biggest threat to global security, bigger than the leaders of the world's two most powerful authoritarian states. We also asked Australians in that same poll whether they thought a more independent foreign policy was in Australia's interests over a closer alliance with the United States. And the results of that suggest, as to Stephen's remarks, that actually Australians are more aligned with our friends in Aotearoa around independent foreign policy. So 59% of Australians thought that a more independent foreign policy was in Australia's interests over a closer alliance with the United States. And if you know anything about the way that Australians have historically thought about that relationship over the last several decades, I think that's a huge change in how Australians understand our relationship with the United States and our role in the world. Excuse my little helper back here. We also found, I think importantly, in terms of our current context and those threats that I mentioned that Trump made, that 68% of Australians oppose Australian involvement in the Iran war, and that 33% of Australians believe that AUKUS, the AUKUS submarine deal, is not in Australia's interests. So again, these seem like really significant numbers to me that indicate a pretty significant shift is underway in how Australians think about our relationship with the United States. And I think in that lies an opportunity because Australia has, as we've heard, historically, I guess, always tended to, at least in the last several decades, double down on our US alliance. And Trump is, I think, threatening to disrupt that historical pattern. And that represents a huge opportunity for Australia that I think lines up with the comments that Joey made about the potential role that Australia can play in the Pacific if we made the choice to do that. Australia has and can play a really positive role, a really constructive role in rebuilding the institutions of international law. And there is clearly the political space, I think, for the current government to begin to think about doing that and to begin to think about recalibrating our relationship with the United States to align much more with the so-called shared values that we're often told underpin that relationship, particularly the shared values of democracy and the rule of law. And the treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Australia's participation in that, and more importantly, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, is an obvious path for Australia to take in beginning to do that. The architecture is there, the international support is there. It's even in the platform of the Australian Labor Party, the current government, the current Prime Minister has historically supported Australia's Australia signing that treaty. So I think that this is a huge opportunity for Australia to take. There is clearly the political space to do that and for Australia to play a really significant driving role in recalibrating our relationship with the United States and in building new structures of international law that can keep us safer. And I guess given the interest of time, I'll leave it there, but of course happy as well to hang around and answer questions. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Sorry, it takes a few seconds to click the buttons. Thanks so much for that, Dr. Emma Soares. So I suppose one of the questions was, which has been prepared for you, was the declaration calls, sorry, for the Australian government to recommit its support to the Treaty of Rarotonga and also calls for urgent signature of the UN Treaty of the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Can you tell us more about the TPNW and what the significance would be for Australia at this time?
Yes, of course, I'd be happy to. And I should say as well that the Australia Institute is a proud signatory of that declaration. And like you, I'd encourage our civil society colleagues to sign that declaration as well. So I think there is momentum for Australia to sign the treaty. As I mentioned, it is in the platform of the current the Australian Labor Party. It has been supported by the Prime Minister. And I think it would be regarded internationally as very significant for Australia to sign that treaty, given precisely our relationship with the United States, and that would be understood as Australia's interests publicly diverging from the United States. Now, we know Australia can do this. Australia has done it relatively recently when the Australian government recognised Palestinian statehood against the, I think, strong pressure of the Trump administration. Australia managed to navigate that, and I don't want to underestimate how difficult it is for Australia to navigate the volatility of the current administration. But I think that move demonstrated that this was possible, and that, again, there is public support for Australia to play such a role, to play a role in opposing the worst excesses of the Trump administration, and particularly its attacks on the rule of law internationally. So that's a long way of saying I think there is the political space to do that. There is support within the party and within the Australian community. And internationally, I think it would be taken as a really big signal if Australia were to sign the treaty. And if we were to do that, I think we would see a number of other nations who are also on the verge of signing the treaty follow. And so the momentum shift would also be quite significant. Given the expiration of the New START Treaty, I think that would also be a really important step in establishing or re-establishing the guardrails around the use of nuclear weapons.
Oh, well, thanks so much for that, Emma. Yeah, the next an excellent presentation. Thanks so much for that, and kind of links together a number of very, very vital points which were raised earlier. The next presenter is Janet Craven, who's going to. Sorry, that question was supposed to be for Janet anyway. But anyway, I got things wrong. Maybe it's getting too late here. So Janet will be talking about the TPNW and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and how it functions. Say briefly in the next few minutes, and because we've been talking about the treaty, and so Emma will, sorry, Janet rather, will elaborate a bit more on that.
Thank you, Stephen. And many thanks to everyone for their contributions. My name is Janet. I am the director of ICANN Australia, and I'm very pleased to be here. And before I start, I just wish to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where we are all joining this call for, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. As you've heard tonight, we've been very fortunate to hear many of the background features that really are shaping this moment in time.
Oh, sorry, Janet. So can I just come in here? Sorry, I forgot to introduce you properly because I missed out on because I'm just scrolling down and then it went down very, very fast. So if I can just properly introduce Janet. Yeah, Janet Craven, she's the new director of the ICANN. She joined ICANN Australia in February 2026, so it's a few months old in ICANN, and brings deep experience in public affairs, humanitarian diplomacy, and weapons treaties. Most recently, she served as public affairs manager for the International Committee of the Red Cross delegation to the European Union, NATO, and Belgium, supporting dialogue on international humanitarian law and relevant weapons instruments, including the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Political Declaration on the Use of Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas. Prior to this, Janet has held senior roles in international humanitarian and development organizations and worked with the Irish Red Cross and the ICRC across Europe and Australian Red Cross across Australia and the Asia Pacific region. In fact, the question which was supposed to be for Janet on the link between the Treaty of Rarotonga and the TPNW. Sorry about that, because I think there was some mess up in the way I was scrolling up and down. So yeah, so please continue with that. My sincere apology for
Okay.
the big diplomatic blunder.
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you, Stephen. We appreciate. We know it's late for you, and we appreciate everyone's time, particularly yours, in keeping us. And I'm very conscious of time, and also of Emma's very capable answer with regards to the connection between Rarotonga and TPNW, and also other contributions that we've had tonight. So I was. I'm a relatively new member of the ICANN organization, and very proud to be here tonight. So I suppose in the mix of everything that we've heard, it's very easy to maybe not feel that there's much hope, and it's very easy to kind of look out at the world and wonder what we can do. But I think it's always very important that we remember there are pathways through. And particularly to remember that the body of law that came to be international humanitarian law was born out of the very darkest and most awful times that we have seen. So within despair, there is always hope. And I think the TPNW itself offers a very strong beacon of hope at this time. Our colleague Vince has given us a very comprehensive overview of the current military reality that we have here in Australia, particularly around some of the changes that are happening with the under AUKUS and the changes to how nuclear weapons could be present in Australia, and some of the very real questions around what that could mean and how the public would be aware of that, and what Parliament, what democratic processes would be involved in that. We've also heard from Joey in terms of the views of our neighbours, and very strongly, as that is stated in the Treaty of Rarotonga and Australia's commitment to a nuclear-free Pacific region, and the very important role that treaty plays in our relationship with our neighbours, and in keeping our promises there. And then finally, Emma has taken us through the very real world issues surrounding Australia's largest and most important alliance with the United States, and what that means currently in terms of how there is a shift within the public opinion, and quite a seismic shift, as Emma has told us, in terms of recent polling from the Australia Institute. And all of this, I think, is if we bring it together, very neatly comes in behind the TPNW. So not only is it a very unique treaty in the weapons treaty space, because it looks for the prohibition rather than the control of the weapon, and I think we're all of us here gathered to understand the very grave nature of nuclear weapons and their use by intention or their use by accident. And the treaty itself has some very unique ways that it not only controls nuclear weapons, but also seeks their eradication from the world. So it looks for signatories to not have nuclear weapons, and if you do have nuclear weapons, to get rid of them. But it also contains clauses that look at the effects of nuclear weapons that are already present in the world today from testing or from their use, and it seeks to address the humanitarian consequences from that in terms of and the environmental consequences. And that is quite a unique point of the treaty itself, in that it has those positive obligations to really, and that's a point that's been well made here tonight in terms of our relationship with the Pacific. But also we must not forget the nuclear testing that has also happened here in Australia, and that has had very severe effects on Indigenous populations and other populations that were closely involved in those testings. So if we look at the TPNW itself and where we are in this moment of time, where there is this unique opportunity that we have a government and a government leader, a prime minister, that has had a very strong stated supporting position of the TPNW, that with a strong indication that Australia would sign. This is, I suppose, a moment in time where we have, through the declaration and through your support, and many of you who are present here are signatories, and thank you for that support. But the declaration represents, I suppose, the best of how we can show and demonstrate to our political leaders that there is not only general support, but there is specific support across civil society, representing a very wide range of organizations, to again remind political leaders that this is a treaty that is not only beneficial immediately, but into the future, when we look at the very real changes that we're seeing in international law. And as has been previously stated, it is a moment in time where Australia could step forward and rewrite some of the undermining that we're seeing of international law and international humanitarian law. And now I'm going to keep my comments short, because I know that we want to move to the Q&A, but I also want to give those of you who are thinking, well, what can I do? What else can I do? So I wanted to just point you towards, there is a petition that we're working with GetUp on, so you can, if you wished and that was something that you would like to do, you can sign that petition. If you do work with an organization and they haven't signed the declaration, then that is also a very strong option. And then there is also the very, I suppose, more personal option of contacting your own political representative and perhaps having a conversation, either through a direct conversation or through contacting them by email to call on them to support Australia signing the TPNW. So in closing, this is definitely a moment in time where we can see many of the factors that both call for a change in how we look and ensure safety around nuclear weapons in Australia, but also it's a moment in time where we can perhaps create a seismic change, a serious change that would lead to a very strong safety procedure that the TPNW ensures being introduced to Australia, and therefore providing wider protections to the region. So thank you again for the opportunity to draw attention to these issues and to our speakers, and I'll hand it back to Stephen. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Janet, for that very it's an amazing presentation, drawing together some of the strands of the significance of the PTNW for Australia, for the Pacific, for the world, and how it contributes to creating that ecosystem of peace that we're all seeking out. And thanks so much for that. And my apology once again for the blunder earlier. Okay, I know that time is running out very, very fast. Now we have time now for questions and answers. I mentioned earlier that it'd be good if you send in your questions in the question and answer box. I have some here, which I will probably read out and see if some of our presenters will be able to respond to that. The US alliance makes Australia a nuclear weapon state by proxy. AUKUS makes Australia a de facto nuclear weapon state. HEU fuel. I've always assumed developments like this would make Indonesia lower the lead time for nuclear weapons, one way or another, or not so. I suppose the question there is quite long. If I can reinterpret or reimagine the question, so the US alliance makes Australia a proxy nuclear power. So would that have implications on countries like Indonesia, for instance, in terms of perhaps giving them the inspiration to, because I know the Indonesia and Australia have always had a very, very tense relationship over the years. So would Australia move in that direction, to create that instability and the potential for the neighbors to do the same thing like Indonesia? So maybe I'll ask Vince that question, or rather that question. was asked by somebody. So Vince is probably, since he was talking about, Australia's link with the US. And of course, I think maybe Emma as well might want to chip in.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in first. Thanks, Stephen, and thank you for the question. Look, I think without a doubt, Indonesia, Malaysia, along with many other regional countries, and not least of all China, have been and will continue to watch the AUKUS submarine developments in Australia very carefully and closely. Even though Australia is not receiving nuclear weapons as part of AUKUS, in terms of the submarines that if we ever get them or ever build them, these are nuclear-powered submarines, not nuclear-armed submarines. Nevertheless, it does weaken the non-proliferation framework because, and arms control experts and non-proliferation experts have pointed out that it normalizes for the first time a non-nuclear weapons state receiving nuclear reactors fueled with the weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium. And in fact, if I recall correctly, both Indonesia and Malaysia expressed concerns about precisely this precedent after AUKUS was announced. In terms of nuclear proliferation more generally, Australia is acquiring kind of sensitive nuclear stewardship expertise, I suppose, and gaining infrastructure and industrial capabilities that are not nuclear direct, but they're adjacent to a nuclear type industry. And, it could be a step along the way towards what's sometimes called the Japan option. So not possessing nuclear weapons, but possessing much of the scientific and industrial and technological base needed for relatively rapid weaponization if circumstances change. So look, Australia is quite far away from that, but the argument is that AUKUS is one step towards that path. However, I don't think the key issue right now for regional countries is that Australia is on the verge or even on the pathway to become nuclear, but more that Australia is becoming ever more deeply integrated into US strategic nuclear operations in the manner that I described. So hosting US nuclear capable forces, providing conventional support for US nuclear operations, and so on. Plus, there's the old story, which I didn't talk too much about in my remarks, but the way in which Australia, through intelligence, surveillance, command and control facilities in Australia, support US nuclear operations.
Oh, thanks so much for that, Vince. Emma, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add very quickly to Vince's remarks that Indonesia has in fact signed and ratified the TPNW, as has Malaysia. And so, Australia doing the same, I think, would contribute significantly to our regional relationships and regional security, especially at a time when, as we've discussed and as Vince mentioned, US actions under the Trump administration are pushing some allies, I think, closer towards nuclearization. I'm thinking particularly of Korea here, where there is I guess there are growing calls for Korea to nuclearize because of the unpredictability and instability of the United States. So, I think the region is in that sense at potentially, at least because of the role of the United States, at somewhat of a tipping point, and Australia could play a really influential role in which way I think things tip.
Well, thanks so much for that, Vince, and Emma. Let me go to the next question. There are not many questions only, but sorry, 3 of them. Sorry about that. Given President Trump's erratic behavior in the geopolitical arena, should Australia withdraw from AUKUS? So, should Australia withdraw from AUKUS? Anyone?
I can
Vince,
have a go
Emma?
at that.
Okay.
I think my answer is probably fairly predictable in that I think, yes, Australia should at least engage in a review process of the AUKUS submarine deal. So the Trump administration has done a review of the AUKUS submarine deal. The United Kingdom has done a review as well. Australia is the only nation in this trilateral deal to not have had a review. And Australia, of course, is the nation that has the most at stake in this process. So it's, I think, pretty striking that there hasn't been any kind of democratic scrutiny of the deal really since the beginning. This deal was effectively sprung on Australians overnight with no public consideration. It wasn't put to cabinet. As far as we know, there wasn't even a basic kind of cost benefit analysis of this deal, which at a minimum, according to official estimates, will cost Australia $368 billion. Although I note even today there was an announcement that Australia will spend an additional $11 billion on a life of type extension of the Collins class submarine, which is having to happen because the rest of the AUKUS deal is so far behind and continues to fall behind. So in that context, again, I think it's pretty extraordinary that there hasn't been this public scrutiny. In fact, we have a petition at the Australia Institute calling for a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS deal, which 40,000 people have signed. And I mentioned as well that, 30%, roughly a third of Australians think that the AUKUS submarine deal is not in our interests. This is the biggest shift in Australian defence and security policy in decades, and we've had no democratic scrutiny. And I think there really is the public space for that. And certainly we would call on the Australian government to engage in that transparent review process at the very least.
And if I can comment on Emma's very well made points.
Yep, sure. Yeah.
I think we would also draw attention to the neither confirm nor deny policy, as was highlighted very well in one of the videos. That is a policy that is one that calls into question very strongly democratic processes and transparency, and the right for people to know whether there are nuclear weapons present here in Australia, and also whether we're meeting the undertakings as part of the Rarotonga Treaty and ensuring that is not being undermined. So that, I think, is also a consideration in that wider question.
Well, certainly. Thanks so much for that.
Sorry, Stephen.
Carry on, Vince.
No. I was just going to add to both those comments that yes, obviously, I think we should withdraw from AUKUS, but I also think it's important that we withdraw for the right reasons, because I worry about what might replace it. AUKUS seems more likely to collapse rather than Australia withdraw in it, and already there is discussions about what a plan B might look like. So we had James Paterson, the Shadow Minister for Defence, suggest in a recent address to the National Press Club that maybe an AUKUS stopgap, which I think is probably more likely plan B in case it fails, that Australia should consider acquiring the US B-21 long-range nuclear-capable strategic bomber. This is the new bomber that the US is developing to replace the B-2 bomber. He didn't say that this was coalition policy, but he said, this idea is worth considering. And he's not the first to come up with it. There's been, let's say, defence hawks in the strategic community talking about Australia getting a B-21 for a long time, whether in addition to AUKUS or as a replacement for AUKUS. So yes, let's get out of AUKUS, before it collapses on its own. But let's not replace it with something similarly strategically and physically irresponsible.
Well, thanks much for that, Vince, Emma, and Janet. Perhaps this is the question there, because events are moving very, very fast. When Trump came in, there were doubts about AUKUS because, as you know, Trump thinks not in terms of the bigger strategic issues of the world and the traditional alliances, but in terms of his pocket and his ego. So there were the people in his group who were basically pushing back on the idea of AUKUS. In fact, thinking that AUKUS is really for them rather than should not be for anyone else. Perhaps I'm not sure how far that has gone in terms of whether that might lead to a collapse or whatever. The other issue is the different layers. One is the geopolitical, geostrategic layer of AUKUS that we're looking at. And there's another layer, and that is to do with the military-industrial complex layer, which is much deeper. Because as a build-up towards AUKUS, universities and corporations in Australia have been positioning themselves in terms of contracting and making money. There's a lot of money to be made from the hundreds of billions of dollars. I know that a lot of university academics have been gearing up, boasting to me that they're going to make lots of money by having that contract on this and this and this and this. And so its roots go beyond just the geostrategic into the economic sphere of the bigger military-industrial complex. So I wonder whether you might want to, and these are amongst the biggest losers. If AUKUS collapses, some of the biggest losers are those with high expectations. What do you think, Vince? Since you're smiling. I think you are muted. Still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yep.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, Stephen, could you repeat the question? I've forgotten now.
Oh, okay. Sorry. The different layers of AUKUS. One is the geostrategic layer, which we've been talking about. The other layer is the military-industrial complex layer, which is more economic, and how universities and corporations in Australia have positioned themselves to try and profit from it. I know a lot of academics have, in fact, the head of the Vice Chancellor's Committee, organization in Australia told the universities, Vice Chancellors, let's get prepared for this. In fact, some universities have signed up in different ways to hoping to get the promised millions in terms of contract from AUKUS. So if AUKUS collapses, amongst the biggest losers here are those with high expectations in the academic world, in the corporate world, who have been dreaming about getting rich out of this.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. There's the whole military industrial academic complex that is developing as a result of AUKUS and just increasing in defense spending more generally, but particularly in the university sector. As a result of the incredible scientific requirements of AUKUS, particularly around nuclear engineering and nuclear safety and so on, but defense dollars more generally. And yes, it's a big problem. And of course, there's like you infer, there's the whole AUKUS enterprise is creating vested interests in different sectors of society, and we want to avoid that as much as possible because once those vested interests are established, it's very difficult to disrupt that. And I don't want to suggest we have a military-industrial complex quite as complex as some other countries, particularly the United States, but we certainly want to make sure we don't go down that direction. So it's another reason to oppose AUKUS, I suppose. But yes, also another obstacle.
Well, thanks so much for that, Vince. I suppose there's no more question on the question and answers. I suppose it's a warning from the operators that it's time to finish. So we've gone over your time by a few minutes. I'll try my best to be very disciplined, but it's a kind of topic which allows you to expand your imagination far and wide. It's a very significant global issue. And certainly the issue of neither confirm nor deny, which has been around since the Cold War, is still ongoing. So much of the Cold War behavior is still around in different ways. So it's significant for us to know that. So thank you so much for everything. Maybe just a wrap up and just a couple of things. One is at the end of the Cold War, it was assumed that that was the end of the nuclear age in terms of the nuclear contestation. That is not really true because it simply went underground. And then now the narrative of war, the nuclear ambition is part of that. When you talk about Russia invading, Ukraine and the threat of a potential nuclear attack by Putin has been there. And of course, Trump and his red button narrative about potential of using it against Iran to obliterate the country. And of course, interestingly, the war in Iran, ironically, has to do with the nuclear weapons as well. As an excuse, basically an excuse to make sure that Iran doesn't get it. That's an excuse they use as a means of, trying to bring about regime change and all those. And of course, now we know that there's something like 12,341, just trying to add up the figures, nuclear warheads which are still around, hidden behind, in the burrows somewhere, with the US and Russia having more than 5,000 each, and the rest, Korea 50, Israel 90, and so forth. Pakistan, United Kingdom, India, France, China, and so forth. So there's a nuclear club. So hopefully Australia won't join them at one point, at a point in the future. So one of the reasons why we're here, just to make sure that nuclear proliferation and nuclear disarmament comes to an end at some point in our lifetime, hopefully. So it's been a great discussion. Thank you so much to Vince, to Joy, Jamila, and Emma and Janet. It's been great listening to you, and of course, I'm sure that those who are linking in online were inspired, and not only in terms of the intellectual depth and also the applied wisdom in relation to nuclearization or the renuclearization of the Pacific, but also in terms of moving forward to make the world a much better place for us, more peaceful place. So yes, of course, the declaration is still open for signature. Those of you who are still here, please inspire your organization and your neighbors to sign up. And I'm sure there will be a follow-up webinar at some point. So now that I think we are over time by about 20 minutes, which is not bad. I was in the conference last week. We were over time by 3 hours, which is very, very quite normal nowadays. So we did quite well. So with those words, I would like to thank all of you, all the presenters. I would like to thank ICANN for organizing this amazing webinar. And I had my birthday yesterday, and I just remembered that I was involved in the NFIP movement, Nuclear Free Independence movement, many, many years ago, since I was in my teens. And I think I led my very first anti-nuclear movement march, which I led when I was a student leader back at USP in Suva about 46 years ago. So I suppose, life goes on. But at the same time, we have to make sure that the future is much better for our children and grandchildren. So thank you so much for everything. Thank you so much, ICANN, for organizing this. I'm sure there'll be another one. And those who are linking in from all parts of Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, and the rest of the world. And good evening from here in Aotearoa. And certainly I speak on behalf of as well of the organizers, of ICANN organizers who are based from Australia. And thank you so much. And let's have a more peaceful future. With those words, I leave you in peace. Thank you very much.